The French police have officially warned Petliura that he is obliged to lead a purely private life and has no right to engage in broad public policy. Most of the parties and groups of both Russian and Ukrainian emigration began to poison Petliura in a formal way. Russians called Petliura an enemy of the Russian people and orthodoxy, a murderer of the Russian officers, an enemy of Great Russia, a German spy, and a traitor, which was not entirely true, as was the epithet of the pogromist. Ukrainians considered an enemy of the Ukrainian people, a traitor to the Ukrainian people, a Polish hireling, which corresponded to some realities. They could not forgive him for the cession of Poland, Galicia and Volhynia. The newspaper of the Maknovist anarchists joined this merrymaking with great pleasure. Petliura did not write memoirs. Maybe he just didn't have time. On the 25th of May, 1926, a man in a work blouse put 5 bullets into him, right on the street, and immediately fell into the hands of passers-by, and they're the police. During the interrogation, he stated that he was a Jew named Samuel Shvartsburt, and killed Petliura in revenge for the bloody Jewish pogroms in Ukraine. Schwartzburt is an extremely interesting character. He was born in Smolensk, lived in Austria-Hungary since 1905, joined the anarchists, participated in their robbery of one of the Viennese banks, was sentenced to hard labor, but somehow got out. In 1910 he found himself in Paris, where he worked as a watchmaker, but he did not break ties with the anarchists. In 1914-1917, he served, or rather, fought, in the French Foreign Legion. In 1917, he returned to Russia. In 1918-1920s, he fought in the ranks of the Red Army in Ukraine, it seems, even at Kotovsky. In 1920, he returned to France. Fortunately, he had French citizenship. He made acquaintance with prominent anarchists and Makhno. In 1928 he left with his family for the USA. The year of death is unknown. In short, the figure is by no means colorless. Schwartzburt's lawyers presented the court with extensive evidence of the Jewish pogroms that took place in reality, and the jury acquitted the defendant outright. Meanwhile, for the sake of historical accuracy, it must be said that Petliura himself did not arrange any Jewish pogroms. What didn't happen? It didn't happen. On the contrary, I tried to fight them as far as I could, up to the execution of the rioters. There are reliable witnesses that this was exactly the case. The leader of Young Zionism, Shabotinsky. It is an absolute fact that neither Petliura, nor Vinchenko, nor any of the leading figures of the Ukrainian government has ever been a pogromist. I grew up next to them. I fought with them against antisemitism. No one will ever be able to convince any of the Zionists of southern Russia that such people were anti-Semites. The leader of the Bund Party, Moses Rafs, one of the most favorite ideas of Petliura and many other Ukrainian nationalists, was the idea of creating a union of Ukrainian and Jewish democracy. Arnold Margolin, General Secretary of the South Russian Department of the Union of Struggle for the Achievement of Equal Rights for Jews. The Ukrainian government has consistently opposed the pogroms, has never taken part in them, and does not bear any responsibility for them. In addition, under Petliura, Jews studied at the honor officer schools, and there were several Jewish ministers in the Directory. Schwartzburt, an informed man who was not acquainted with petty politicians, simply could not have been unaware of all this. And yet, he shot Petliura. The story is dark. Some people, without further ado, especially considering Schwartzburt's biography, believed him to be a Soviet agent. However, one can doubt this, knowing the practice. Soviet intelligence in Europe was not before the murder of Petliura, nor after it was noticed in the actions of vulgar revenge, nor the Caucasian Oberkichi. Generals Kutupov and Miller were abducted, not because of their White Guard past, but because they continued the war with the USSR, led a rather serious organization of the ROF's Russian All-Military Union, consisting of former officers and anti-Soviet-minded emigrant youth. From here, Sergei Makhachev's poems did not appear from scratch. The messenger of the white gangs crossed the border enemy, spy and saboteur. The ROVs sent not only spies, but also terrorists to Russia. Their biggest actions were a bomb thrown at the Leningrad Party Club. There are many wounded and killed, and a derailed train, where the deputy plenipotentiary representative of the GRU in Belarus, Apansky, died. So in war it's like in war. At the same time, the Chekists never touched Denikin, who was mainly engaged in memoirs, nor Wrangel, a purely decorative figure in the Rovs, nor Makhno, who drank blood from the Bolsheviks cleaner than Petliura, nor General Shkuro, an active member of white emigrant organizations, but not involved in direct military operations. Even the sad memory of General Slashev, who littered the Crimea with gallows, moved to the Soviet Union, and taught at higher military educational institutions for 7 years, until he was shot by a Red commander, who avenged his brother who was hanged at the time, by order of Slashev. In a word, the story is dark. Others sinned against Makhno's wife Galina, an energetic and strong-willed woman, who in general had motives. She aspired to return to the USSR, worked in the openly pro-Soviet Union of Ukrainian citizens in France, and of course, wanted forgiveness from the Soviet authorities. Makhno himself, however, condemned Petliura's murders in print and rejected his antisemitism. In addition, Petliura, who had lost any real influence on a somewhat significant number of emigrants, still remained a kind of brand, in modern terms, which hindered the new wave, young growth, young wolves, nationalist extremists, who soon created the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the very sinister OUN, which will be discussed in the future. And in addition, Petliura was hated by the monarchists grouped around Skoropadsky, and the White Guards, and a lot of other movements and parties. In a word, it's a dark matter. The devil himself has a lot of words, and that's all of them. Let's go back to Soviet Russia, or rather, to Soviet Ukraine. The victorious Bolsheviks began to construct the Ukrainian USSR without the slightest regard for the centuries-old history of Russia and Ukraine. Donbass and Kryvyi, inhabited mainly by Russians, were annexed to Little Russia so that the new Soviet Republic, which had been mainly an agrarian region before, would also receive industry, a mighty industry, and coal mines. Novorossiya and other territories, which again had nothing to do with Ukraine before, were slaughtered. The capital of the USSR was not Kiev, but Kharkiv, founded in the 17th century as a Russian fortress, and always remained before as part of Russia, no matter how it was called. The future collapse of the USSR could not have been imagined by the Soviet leadership in a nightmare, and it simply manipulated individual regions, like pieces on a chessboard, within the framework of a single state, which was considered eternal. Crimea, however, then no one began to attach to Ukraine. Considering that many Tatars lived there, it was proclaimed the Crimean Autonomous USSR, as part of the USSR in 1921st year. And things have gone well in Ukraine. Officially, the policy of so-called Koreanization or Ukrainization was proclaimed on a grand scale, which, perhaps, was not even under Skoropadsky and Petliura. The Ukrainian Bolsheviks, led by a prominent Soviet figure Skripnik, People's Commissar of Education Shusky, and a former security officer, and later writer Mykola Khvalev, pseudonym. In fact, this character is a pure-blooded Russian. They declared a formal war on the Russian language, yesterday's language of bourgeois culture, the language of oppression of Ukrainians. Employees of all enterprises and institutions were assigned not only to conduct office work in Ukrainian, but also to speak it at work and at work. The press, radio, cinema, theaters, and education were translated into Ukrainian, more precisely, into the same Galician language. From now on, it was absolutely necessary to teach and conduct scientific activities in Ukrainian. A group of academics developed new spelling, clean dictionaries, invented a lot of purely Ukrainian terms for scientific and technical literature. The head of this group, hold on to the chairs, was none other than Mikhail Grushevsky. They planted an atomic bomb in a building called Russia. It also jerked then. Frankly vegetating in tiny Austria now, a bearded troll, back in 1920th year, began bombarding the Bolsheviks with humiliated messages, asking for a refund. In a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party B, he recognizes the merits of the Bolsheviks in the fight against capitalism, assures that, like other Ukrainian social revolutionaries, he refused to support the nationalists and accepted the principles of the Third International. To the then representative, the People's Commissar of the Ukrainian SR wrote to Rakovsky even more definitively, "We were ready to step over the corpses of our party comrades who died innocently from red bullets. We were ready to work under your leadership." The Bolsheviks, who at every opportunity tried to masterfully split emigration of any kind, liked the requests. After all, Grushevsky was a big figure. He was quickly forgiven and invited to Ukraine, vaguely promised to make the president of the All-Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, but put only the head of the Department of History as such. Not particularly upset, Grushevsky zealously set about Ukrainization. The rampant Ukrainizers enlisted the word about Igor's regiment in the masterpieces of Ukrainian literature. The same thing happened in Belarus, but not so zealously, given the much softer national character of Belarusians. And yet, in the birth certificate of my late mother, there is an admirable entry in its idiocy. Nationality of the father: Polish, mother's nationality. Polish, the nationality of the child. Belarusian. 1928 year. Following Grushevsky, loudly repenting of his previous mistakes, a considerable number of his followers, from the time of the Central Rada, poured into Ukraine. Moreover, a fair number of former Petliurists, officers, officials, public figures. After the defeat of the Petliura underground, so to speak, it was legalized and settled in provincial and district administrative institutions, sometimes in quite responsible positions. They took positions in district executive committees and village councils, and went to urban-rural schools as teachers in many cases. It was such an audience that made up the backbone of the Ukrainizers. Why are they coming here, Ivan Fedorovich? They had supporters on the ground in some places. Individual, it is that individual, working Ukrainians have moods of a kind of Ukrainian pride, expressed in the desire to hastily Ukrainize everything. But in the majority of the population of the USSR, with a considerable number of ethnic Russians, they openly rejected the Ridna Mova imposed on them, the same Galician dialect, supplemented by a mass of frankly invented words by the Grushevites, borrowings from Latin, Polish and German. Sometimes they wrote openly about newspeak. No one knows him, and does not want to know. Few people read newspapers and books on it. Few people visited Ukrainian language theaters. From the lips of the Ukrainizers themselves, complaints sounded, the Philistine public wants to read not a local newspaper, just not a Ukrainian one. Our Ukrainian newspaper is still not widely distributed in rural areas. Ukrainian literature does not go widely, we have to distribute it by force. I had the opportunity to observe the speech of teenagers, boys and girls, students of Poltava labor and vocational schools, where the language of instruction is Ukrainian. The speech of these children is some kind of ugly conglomerate, some kind of unspeakable mishmash of Ukrainian and Moscow words. For the workers of the Kiev arsenal and other factories, who remembered the very recent Ukrainization by the Rada and Petliurists, what was happening turned out to be extremely suspicious, and at meetings with the party and Soviet leadership, and in letters to newspapers and authorities, the question was openly voiced, is not the current Ukrainization, Petliurism, under a new guise? The attitude of the majority of workers in both Kiev and Donbass with Kryvyi Rog to the Ukrainization of trade unions was openly negative. At one of the factories, workers simply tore down a posted ad just because it was written in newspeak. There is more than one case when collective agreements written in Ukrainian were pelted with mud. The miners of the Artemovsky district, in the polls conducted by journalists, said, at their mines, they speak Ukrainian only in jest, and if they talk about something serious, only in Russian. There were often disputes over which language to conduct production meetings in, Ukrainian or Russian. A certain engineer Kosaganov, who taught construction disciplines, said, "It is extremely difficult to translate a subject like mine into Ukrainian." Quite often, the Soviet and trade union apparatus slowly sabotaged Ukrainization. It came to form jokes. A certain builder wrote that Ukrainians should be taught Ukrainian, but there is nothing to teach Katsapps and Jews. The joke is that this builder himself was a pure-blooded Jew, that is, a Jew. The worker Dontsov, an ethnic Ukrainian, openly declared that the Ukrainian language was needed in the village, not in the enterprise. However, the situation in the village was not so clear. In the village of Bolshoi Fontan of the Odessa district, the peasant exodus simply did not allow the local teacher to make a report in Newspeak. Purely ethnic Ukrainian peasants in other places asked visiting speakers not to speak Ukrainian either, because they do not understand anything. However, there was no need to speak Russian either. In our way, in the village, they are in Ukrainian, that is, in the old local dialects. Russian with a large sprinkling of local words. One of the Ukrainizers, an academician, wrote dejectedly, when someone from the management comes to the village and begins to speak Ukrainian, the men scratch their heads and say, well, it means that we have to pay something again. Because they are told about taxes, duties and so on, in Ukrainian every time. If they speak Russian, you can be calm. It will be about the international, about the world bourgeoisie, and other neutral affairs for which there is no need to pay. So much for Ukrainization. Well, the peasants showed their usual everyday practicality. Residents of 4 districts of the Taganrog district complained about Ukrainization, about the incomprehensible new language to which the governing bodies and schools had switched, promised to seek the annexation of their districts to their with the eternal peasant cunning, adding that they were guided primarily by the installations of the Soviet government, which declared the right of the nation to self-determination. For the sake of truth, it should be added that a couple of authorities within the RSR, populated mainly by Ukrainians, demanded just the opposite, joining the Ukrainian SR. From the secret reference of the GPU to the then General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine Kaganovich, at that time, the republics had their own generals. This will later make them just the first. Ukrainization. The technical work of the police apparatus is carried out entirely in Ukrainian. GPU technical work is carried out partially. The members of the candidate of the SIPU mostly speak Russian due to the fact that they do not speak Ukrainian. As the Strugatskys wrote in another novel, Vybegala's ideas turned out to have some terrible side. Secret reports of the GPU are full of mentions that the majority of the population is categorically against Ukrainization, and the imposition of a language that the majority of the population simply does not understand. And conflicts on this basis, which is always bad, began in army units. In turn, the foreign intelligence of the GPU reported that Ukrainization has greatly encouraged immigrants who see in what is happening the hope that Ukraine will still become independent. In one of the Lviv newspapers, Levitsky, a rather prominent figure of the Ukrainian National Democratic Association, wrote, "Independent Ukraine, in order to become a great power, should also receive Voronezh, Kursk, Novorossiysk provinces, Stavropol territory, Don, Cuban, Polish provinces with Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, and in addition colonies in Turkestan and Siberia." On the one hand, it is a comedy, considering that these projects were made on the territory that was actually a semi-colony of Poland. On the other, slowly, something unfolded that was no longer a laughing matter. Emboldened, the completely finished nationalists and self-helpers began to raise their heads. Having played to Volyovo, he openly declared, Ukraine will go to socialism in a slightly different way, at least in one political Soviet Union with Russia, and a little later, he proclaimed the slogan away from Moscow altogether. Here in Moscow, they were seriously alarmed, finally realizing that they had warmed a snake on their chest. The secret reports of the chairman of the district party committees in the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party were reported in the circles of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, especially in the anti-Soviet part of it, the idea of Ukraine's independence, its liberation from Moscow's guardianship, is still popular. Ukraine for Ukrainians, and the belief that it is necessary to resolve the national issue on their own, and this can be done only with the independence of Ukraine. And Moscow grinned. The GPU was raised to its feet, which quickly launched a struggle against bourgeois nationalism, to which a considerable number of Ukrainizers were counted. The word bourgeois, in general, is a tribute to the vocabulary of that time, but the independent artists were not fictional, but the real ones, seriously intending to seek the independence of Ukraine. Vinichenko and Shapoval, who headed the social democratic circles of Ukrainian emigration, pushed the emigrants to return to their homeland so that they would occupy as many responsible posts as possible and achieve real sovereignty from the USSR. And Petliura, back in 1923, advised the Ukrainian underground to penetrate the apparatus of the Communist Party. The Komsomol, trade unions, education and culture, command positions in the Red Army, KFU, militia for their rebirth, decomposition, explosion from within. So the vast majority of cases brought against bourgeois nationalists were not fake, but quite real. There were many people who worked hard solely to achieve independence. In 1928, the case of a Gajinsky party member was rumbled in party circles. Speaking at the Next Asset, he accused the Odessa Party Committee of Neo-Little Russia, covering Odessa great power and anti-Ukrainian chauvinism, in mockery of the so-called democratization. In his opinion, the great power professorship, which did not recognize the USSR and engaged in hidden Ukrainophobia, continued to work in Odessa universities. And in general, there is a Russification of Ukraine. Had this happened a few years earlier, perhaps his speeches would have been applauded, but his friend played too much, and did not take into account that the course was changing in the most decisive way. The Bureau of the Odessa District Party Committee slapped the ardent speaker Strogich and forced him to admit mistakes, a wrong understanding of national politics. Arrests began. If with kinks, then not special. The cases, I repeat, were not typical. Kholevo, who was well aware of the mores of his once native office, managed to shoot himself, knowing full well that after everything he said openly, they would probably come for him first. So did Skripnik. However, a lot of independent people fell into the hands of the GPU, who untied their tongues without any torture. Grushevsky slipped through. After a brief arrest in 1931 year, he was released again, and in 1934 year, he died in his bed, having been awarded an obituary in Pravda. It was later that he was posthumously ranked among the bourgeois nationalists, and from now on, they wrote about him exclusively as in the Encyclopedic Dictionary of 1953 that I quoted. In a word, by the mid-30s, the self-styled people had been swept away, the Ukrainizers were reined in, and the ugliest manifestations of Ukrainization were eliminated, pulled down properly. Now no one dared to pull tricks like what happened in 1932 year, when the People's Commissariat of the Fishing Industry of the USSR with childish simplicity forbade the supply of caught fish to Russia, leaving everything to the last tail in Ukraine. But even later, the USSR continued to grow territories through the works of the Bolsheviks. After the fall of Poland, Stalin incorporated Galicia with Volhynia, as well as Transcarpathian Rus and Bukovina into the USSR. Although Slavs lived in the last two districts, they had nothing to do with Ukrainians. Today's Ukrainian accusers of the tyrant, nevertheless, do not think to condemn the late Secretary General for generous gifts to the independent, showing obvious inconsistency. Of Stalin's iniquities, they condemn only those that they do not like. But they take for granted the generous gifts, without any reason, made both before Stalin, and by Stalin, and after Stalin. The old Ukrainian emigration, the figures of the Central Rada, the Hetman's Ukrainian state, and the Directory gradually aged, went off the stage, turning into a kind of museum exhibits. In the first place, however, interspersed with a certain number of old people, those very young wolves, a new generation of nationalists and independents moved forward. And now in these operettas, there was not a penny left. A lot of blood was shed even before the Second World War, and only when the Patriotic War broke out. As already mentioned, the Ukrainian emigration has split into countless parties and movements. Almost all of them were what the Poles mockingly call sofa parties, due to the fact that all party members can fit on one sofa. This expression was applied not only to Ukrainians, but also to themselves. By 1926 year, when Pilsudski took power, as many as 112 parties were enthusiastically raging in the Polish family, which was too much not only for Poland, but perhaps for China. An example in the world history of a unique, worthy Guinness Book. The same Archduke Wilhelm joined one of the parties. By some inexplicable dictate of the soul, he actively collaborated with the Ukrainian nationalists for the rest of his life. In 1947 year, he mysteriously disappeared in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. Speaking cynically, perhaps it's also that he simply had nowhere to go. The deposed Emperor Charles tried twice, including through armed rebellion, to become at least the Hungarian king. The Entente countries and the dictator of Hungary, Admiral Horthy, disrupted this enterprise every time. In the end, Hungary passed a law depriving the Habsburgs of their rights to the Hungarian crown, and the Austrian parliament also passed a law according to which no member of the Habsburg family was allowed in the territory of the Republic from now on, which was abolished only in the 80s of the last century. Karl was exiled to Madeira, where he died in 1922, only 35 years old. His wife survived him by 77 years. Naturally, all the activities of the sofa parties were reduced to an empty talking room. Those who, like Petliura, tried to create an underground on the territory of Soviet Ukraine were defeated every time. Well, other people showed up pretty quickly. No longer talkers, but a completely different flight, terrorists who were not afraid of blood at all. In 1920th year, the Ukrainian Military Organization UVO was established in Prague. There weren't that many members, 1,000 or 2 people, but almost all of them have fought a lot in their time. Former officers of the Ukrainian Galician Army and the Petliura Upper were led by Colonel Yevgeny Konovalets, and in western Ukraine by Colonel Andrei Melnik. This company considered terror to be the best means of propaganda. Raids on the territory of Soviet Ukraine began very quickly. Moreover, in 1921 year, the UVO militants unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate Pilsudski, and in 1924, the President of Poland Wojciechowski. After that, as it is easy to guess, the Polish special services began to pay the closest attention to the UVO. Since you can't live on your own membership fees, the UVO very quickly established ties with Germany. The interest was mutual. The members of the UVO conducted active intelligence activities against Poland, and in exchange, they received not only money, but also the right to freely organize their gatherings in Germany. In 1928, Polish intelligence gathered enough material about these connections, and expressed an official diplomatic protest to Berlin. Germany at that time was weak, with 100,000 Reichswehr, without heavy artillery, aviation, armored forces and a navy, and the Polish army outnumbered it, both in numbers and in armament. Therefore, the Germans stopped funding the High for several years, but the money flowed from the crowded Ukrainian diasporas in the USA and Canada. Interestingly, Petliura, a moderate socialist, was hostile to the terrorist UVO, which he openly expressed. So, as it was said, in addition to Moscow, other studies can be seen in his murder. In January-February 1929, an organization was created that became more widely and infamously known: Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The UVO initially became its fighting faction, but in 1934 year, it finally merged with the UN, whose members themselves were quite good at using pistols and explosives. In fact, the UN has developed an extensive program for the future development of an independent state, which promised the nationalization of forests, and an 8-hour working day, and compulsory free secondary education, and the division of landlords' lands between Christians, and the nationalization of large-scale industry, and freedom of religion for adherents of all religions. But absolutely everything, it has always remained only on paper.